I have been adding plants to the Grotto Paludarium, but I'm not to the point where I can share that process with you. In the first episode of this series, I got to the point where we had just finished putting in the framework to be able to put in the rock wall. So that is where we'll pick it up in this episode. The trick to making a rock wall look natural is to have the fracture lines in the rock that you're using line up naturally, which is really hard to do if you pick small pieces of rock from the start. The rock hardscape will look more realistic if you start with larger pieces of rock and break them apart. I have chosen a very dark rock that has long fracture lines and is pretty hard to break. The result will be a lot of smaller pieces that will look like they fit together like a puzzle. This is going to be a paludarium, and you'll see most of the rock above the water in a vivarium. But the same principle applies for aquatic aquascapes. If you can keep your lines natural, it'll look a whole lot better. The really good hardscape artist will tell you to get twice as much material than you think you will need. So I broke up about 50 pounds of rock. The first thing I do is lay out all the larger pieces of rock and orient them into positions so that their edges kind of line up. It would be dangerous to the tank to try to assemble the wall vertically, so the whole tank gets set on its back, and then I start to dry fit pieces into the tank to see how best to make them fit. This is actually a long process and something that I work on in multiple sessions over a couple of days. I probably rescape the whole thing a dozen times. Even if I like how it looks, I will take it apart and start over. Eventually, the pieces start to go into the same spots each time I try, and that is when I know I'm getting close to the arrangement that I will keep. Once I am comfortable with the scape, I will tack the rock pieces to the plastic grating skeleton with hot glue just to hold them in place. Here I am working on the false wall piece that will cover the pump chamber. The bigger pieces of rock are all that I'm installing with hot glue. Eventually, these will all be embedded in expanding foam, and when I do that, I will slip in some smaller pieces to fill in any larger gaps. This rock wall is going to be heavy. The plastic grating skeleton and expanding foam will hold the rock together and adhere it to the walls of the tank, but I do not trust them to support all the weight long term. I am building the wall so that the rocks at the bottom are going to support the weight of the rocks above them. I don't know if this is going to work or not, but if the whole thing comes crashing down and destroys the tank, then you would not be seeing this video. So it must have worked. After all the larger pieces of rock are glued down, I will apply Great Stuff expanding foam into the gaps between and behind the rocks. It is important that the rocks are embedded in the foam, so I will use a lot and carve away the excess later. While the foam is still very soft, I am wedging small slivers of rock into the larger gaps. The goal is to have a rock wall with very narrow crevices, which also looks more natural than wide gaps. The only part of the hardscape that is not well supported from below is the section immediately above the pump chamber. I will use a lot of foam to completely fill this space in the corner and let the foam expand to partially encase the back side of the wood. Since that wood is anchored top and bottom, once it is connected to the heavy rock wall with foam, it should act as a buttress and hold up the entire hardscape. That's the plan anyway. Any gap between the rocks, the wood, the skeleton, and the glass will get foam. Plenty of it. After the foam cures completely, I cut away all the excess with a variety of sharp objects. This is the most tedious part of the project. Luckily for you, I managed to not record all the removal of the excess foam, so we can fast forward to the next step. The plastic on the back of the false wall is there just to support the process of building it, and now that the foam is solid, I can remove it. I will not carve away any of this foam because it will not be visible, and it will make the false wall stronger to have its skeleton encased in the foam. There are still some gaps that I think look too big and very unnatural, so I'm going to silicone some more rock into the gaps. This will also help to hide the foam. Here is the almost finished false wall. The rest of the hardscape inside the enclosure should look about the same. Now I have a problem I did not anticipate when I started the project. The overhang skeleton I installed earlier failed, so I have to build a new one, and I do have a better plan. But to do it, I need to stand the tank up vertically on its top. This is a moment of truth. If everything has been supported well enough, nothing should fall. The skeleton for the improved overhang will be more plastic grate, and I'm going to adhere it to the glass with M1 sealant. M1 sticks to plastic better than silicone does, but silicone sticks better to glass. M1 takes about 24 hours to completely cure, so once this little job is done, I have to wait a while. 24 hours later, the skeleton is pretty solid, but I don't trust the M1 to hold the weight of the overhang to the glass roof forever, so I'm going to encase the base of the plastic in silicone, which I do trust to stick to the glass. First, I use isopropyl alcohol to clean the glass on both sides of the wall. Then I apply a thick bead of silicone along the front side. I cannot get the caulk gun behind the wall, so I use the finger of a rubber glove like a cake decorating bag to apply the sealant back there. Then I spread the silicone through the wall so that there is silicone spanning glass to glass. I'm not too worried about how this looks because this is all going to get covered in expanding foam. 24 hours later, the silicone is set and the wall is now very firmly attached to the glass. Ready for foam. I cover the entire overhang with expanding foam front and back. More on the front. After the foam is cured overnight, I can cut away the excess and try to shape it to look natural. I am not a good sculptor, but this is going to get covered with other materials and plants, so I'm not going to stress about how it looks now. Now let's turn the enclosure right side up and take a look at what we got. Let's take a look at how well the false wall covers the front of the pump chamber. Just to see what it looks like, I will also put in some of the accent rocks that will not be glued in place, but will be there to create a more realistic transition from the rock wall to the substrate of the water section and further hide the edges of the false wall. And there we have it. The Grotto Paludarium has its hardscape in place. The next task is to soften the harsh edges and hide any exposed foam, which I will do in the next installment of this video series. Thanks for watching.